Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the Libertarian Angle on the burning issues of the day. I'm joined as I am every week by Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to see you and to share some time with our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, thanks you all for tuning in and for your great support. If you're new to FFF, come and visit us at fff.org. You'll find there some 28 years of articles, videos, perspectives, conferences, and so forth, all providing the uncompromising or principal case for the free society. All right, Richard, big thing in the news, socialism. It seems to be a constant theme these days, especially with the Democrats and the Republicans that are running for president, but also in the larger context of the ideological battles that are taking place. So I thought we would discuss socialism in 30 minutes, sort of like Socialism 101 from a libertarian perspective. So let me go first, and then I'll pass the baton over to you. As I understand the socialist paradigm, in its pure sense, the government owns the means of production. Well, what does that mean? Well, essentially it means the government owns everything. It owns the businesses, the factories, and in the purest case, it owns the homes. I suppose in the purest socialist society, there's certain things that still belong to the people, like a toothbrush or something, but basically everything belongs to the state, and therefore everybody works for the state. Now, I've traveled to Cuba, and it was a shocking notion. I mean, I've studied socialism for many, many years, but it was a shocking notion that just about everybody, I'd say like 99% of people, work for the government. They're all government employees. And a marked characteristic of a socialist system is that everybody's equal. There's equalization of wealth. I mean, that's the reason, for example, why Fidel Castro established his communist system and seized all the businesses and the mansions and the industries and so forth, was this idea of equalization, taking from the rich and equalizing, bringing them down, and then helping the poor, giving them the access to the mansions, and let the state own the business where there wouldn't be any profit seeking or bourgeois capitalist swine in society. Well, everybody in Cuba was equal, well, except probably for Fidel Castro and some of the higher ups. But basically, everybody was equally poor. I mean, everybody was on the verge of starvation. I mean, this is what happens when you go into this pure socialist construct where the state owns everything. Now, simply because a state hasn't done that, a nation hasn't done that, there are also variations of the socialist construct. For example, the welfare state. I mean, that's the kind of society in which we live. It essentially nationalizes the results of production, not the means of production. They remain in private hands, but the results of production, that is the national income tax, that everybody's income is now subject to being seized by the state, and the state sets the percentage. Sometimes they're good to us and they let us keep more. Sometimes they're not so good to us and they let us keep less. But make no mistake about it, the government's in charge by virtue of the fact that it's setting the percentage. And it's embodying the Marxian principle, from each according to ability to each according to need, when it takes money from those who have it in order to give it to those who need it. So that's the massive system of welfare statism that we have in this country. Some people might call it mandatory charity, which of course is no charity at all because it's mandated. Charity comes from the willing heart of an individual. So the welfare state consists of all of these confiscate and transfer programs: Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, farm subsidies, education grants, foreign aid to dictators, and all the rest of the dole society. And then there's the concept of central planning, which is another feature of socialism. That's where a government board of commissars, bureaucrats, politicians plan in a top-down command and control fashion the complex processes of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of people. An example, of course, is from your book, Monetary Central Planning in the State, where the Federal Reserve plans this complex system of monetary central planning, engages in this process called monetary central planning, which is extremely complex, and which is also why we have these booms and busts and bubbles inflating and bubbles bursting and the chaos that comes with monetary central planning. As you know, Richard, they've destroyed the money that was the official money of the United States, the gold coins and silver coins that the Constitution established as the monetary standard. They destroyed that through the Federal Reserve. Public schooling is another example, government schooling. You've got a central board of politicians at the local level or bureaucrats at the state level, at the federal level, planning in a top-down fashion the educational decisions of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions of children. And of course, we have all the chaos and crisis in education as well. Immigration is another example. Immigration central planning, where they're planning the movements, complex movements of people in this complex labor market. And of course, we've had an ongoing crisis, what Ludwig von Mises called planned chaos in immigration. So, if you look around the world, whenever you see crises, especially economic crises, but also healthcare crises like Medicare, a socialist program, or education crises, you're going to find inevitably a socialist system or a feature of a socialist system. What do you think, Richard?
Well, let me sort of add or complement to that by explaining sort of the historical evolution of the socialist idea over in a brushstroke fashion over the last 200 years or so. There were forms of what today we call socialist or collectivist conceptions in the ancient world. One can go back to Plato's Republic, in which, in his ideal image of the perfect society, the guardians, the warriors who are to protect the city-state, to see that they don't take advantage of their military prowess to plunder the very citizens of Athens whom they're supposed to protect. They're going to live under communism, that is, communal ownership. Plato believing, as most socialists have more or less over the centuries, that if you do away with the institution of private property, you will somehow change human nature. People will no longer be acquisitive, possessive, concerned with themselves. So if you do away with private ownership and you have collective ownership, men turn from individual focus to collective or group or societal focus, and people will be concerned with the common good and not their own interest. And those ideas have circulated and been around since, like, say, the ancient Greeks with Plato. But in the modern era, by which I mean the last 200 years or so, the socialist idea in its current garb began to emerge out of the French Revolution. And in the early decades following that, in the early decades of the 19th century, the words socialism and communism were often used interchangeably as synonyms. The same way, though not really perfectly, we talk about the interchangeable uses of the word liberty and freedom, which historically are not really always the same overlapping concepts. But in the early part of the 19th century, socialism and communism basically were used interchangeably. And they meant a collective ownership, a collective participatory process that would do away with private ownership of the means of production and production for the good of the society as opposed to individual profit. Now, there were differences among socialists. Some socialists said, well, in the future planned collective society, we'll emphasize an industrial system. Others talked about a rural, idyllic environment of men because industry was somehow anti-human. And then there were those who said, well, you know, socialism can come through persuading our fellow men and enlightening them about a better way to live. And then you had others, basically Karl Marx, who believed that socialism is coming, but whether people want it or not, that there are these laws of historical evolution that follow like a trajectory of a bullet. And it goes from primitive slavery to feudalism, to capitalism, to socialism, and then totally post-scarcity collective communism. Uh, Now, the other thing that was common to many of these socialists in the middle and then in the latter decades of the 19th century was a momentous debate, and that was how is socialists going to come to power? And this basically ended up bringing about the difference between, quote, socialists and communists in the late 19th and then the early 20th century out of the Russian Revolution of 1917. Those socialists who were guided by Marx's ideas, Karl Marx's ideas, said that the capitalists will never give up their property and their plundering ability without a fight. And therefore, only a violent revolution can bring about the transformation from capitalism to socialism. And that will require the initiation and a continuance of a dictatorship of the proletariat. That was a phrase that Marx himself came up with, because it would be necessary to re-educate the people to free them from their remaining residues of a capitalist or self-interested mentality, and to see that the former ruling class, the capitalists, remained repressed and, quote, re-educated. Now, counter to them were those socialists who also particularly were in Germany in the late 19th century, who rejected this Marxian model. They said society can be transformed. You don't have to wait for history to come at some date. And it doesn't have to be violent. We can have it through elections, persuade people to vote for the Social Democratic Party, that is the Socialist Democratic Party, and we can get enough seats in Parliament, the German Reichstag, and we can legislate changes, and therefore through legislation and the democratic method, that is the ballot box rather than bullets, transform the society to socialism. However, through the late 19th century and through a good part of the 20th century, one has to appreciate that this supposed distinction between the socialists and the communists was really primarily over means, not ends. They may have argued, well, how do we come to power? Bullets or ballots? But they all agreed in general about the end to be achieved. Whether done through democratic processes or a revolution, private ownership of the means of production would be ended. The means of production would be nationalized, socialized under the guidance of the government in the name of and for the people, and there would be central planning. There would no longer be private enterprise, no longer private business, no more profit motives, no more market competition. There would be a centralized planning agency that would decide what to produce, where to produce, how to produce, when to produce, with what resources, with what labor, in what quantities, and to whom to distribute it. So through a good part of the 20th century, after the Russian Revolution of 1917, the great chasm between socialists and communists was not the end, but merely an argument over the means to attain it. Now, to their credit, you have to give the devil their due. There were many socialists in the West who really believed in this ideal of central planning and common ownership, and that private property was bad. But many of them would not go along with the communists. They valued what they believed were the democratic method and certain essential human liberties higher than achieving socialist planning by any means. So one has to give them their due. They would not give up certain residue beliefs of personal freedom and democratic methods, even to achieve their socialist end. And they opposed the communists during a good part of the Cold War. But the fact is, even they still had their own purposes. Now, that got transformed. Now, you were saying that, well, socialism is also the welfare state. Socialism is also the regulated economy. And that is true. But what was going on also in the 20th century was two things. The realization that if you follow a socialist path, such as the Marxian model, it not only transformed the economy, but it does away with freedom. When the government owns all the means of production, it determines what books get published, what movies gets made, what religions could be practiced, because the government either allocates resources for people to have a church to have a common worship at or not. The government is the only employer, and therefore you don't want to get on the wrong side of your superiors in the hierarchy of the state institutions, because they hold your future, and your fate in their hands. And just realize that this could lead to, quote, tyranny. Also was the discovery that socialist central planning didn't work, as you're alluding to as well, that by doing away with markets and prices, there was, as you in Ludwig von Mises, not prosperity and plenty for all, but planned chaos. So they had to take a step back a little bit. And in the post-World War II period, you saw, however grudgingly, however reluctantly, however hesitatingly, a growing number of socialist parties in Western Europe giving up the ghost and saying, well, we don't really need to nationalize everything and have a fully centralized economy. What is it that we really want? Why do we want this socialist system? For social justice, for equity, for fairness, for equality, by which they meant income or material equality. So let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater. Let's have a certain amount of free enterprise, even vibrant free enterprise, but regulated, controlled, restricted, partially directed, prohibited when necessary. In other words, the heavy-handed regulatory interventionist state rather than direct and total planning. And then that will enable us to nudge capitalism and the evil capitalists in the directions we think they should go, and harness them so that their greed doesn't get off the rail and take society into an oppressive and exploitive direction, rather than where social needs of the people should have doing things. And at the same time, there was obviously income inequality. The rich had more, the growing upper middle class had more. So we will then introduce a welfare state, a redistributive system, to bring about the purpose for which we want socialism, an equality of outcomes, particularly material outcomes. And we will take from the Peters who have too much, and we'll give to the Pauls who we have defined as not having enough. And that is basically what the socialist ideal got transformed into in the latter part of the post-World War II period, away from socialist central planning and the crudeness and brutality and the tyranny of that Soviet model, into this sort of kinder and gentler system of a regulated economy with redistribution of wealth. Now, you know, the thing that needs to be remembered is that, it's less harsh than the KGB. It's less manipulative, directly controlling as a government central planning agency, command and directing everything from a center. But we should not lose the fact that to the extent that the government regulates, controls, restricts, it is then determining what gets produced, who produces it, where, how, rather than the market. And what is the market? The market is nothing more than you and me, all of us, choosing what is it that we value, what would we like to have, what would we be willing to produce and offer to the market to generate the income that enables us to then return to that market as consumers ourselves and buy the things that our income then permits us to do. And at the same time, the welfare state does away with a justness of those who have earned serving their fellow men in the marketplace, receive the fruits of their labor as their fellow neighbors have evaluated it. If someone has a higher income than another, it's not because of injustice, it's not because of exploitation, it is not because of violence. In a truly free market environment, each one receives what their fellow men thinks they're worth. The basketball player who's a professional sportsman earns a lot more than, I know it's hard to believe, a free market professor of economics. Go figure. But the fact is that each of us receive the wage that reflects what our fellow citizens or fellow human beings believe our services to be worth to them. And therefore, there's a justness in the distribution of wealth because it reflects our value to others, which then enables us to determine the value of our fellows by how we spend the money we've earned serving them. There's a justice to it, a fairness to it, an equality of rights and respect for voluntary decision making. The welfare state does away with that. The state garnishes our income in varying amounts, as you said. It decides, well, will you keep 70% of it? Will you keep 50% of it? Will you keep this amount, that amount? And then we will decide how the portion that we've expropriated from you, and the state is expropriating it by the threat of violence through taxation. We will decide, well, what kind of health care you need, what kind of retirement pension you need, what type of education you and your children should have, what kind of housing, what kind of this, kind of that. And to the extent that the government siphons off wealth in this fashion, besides and in addition to its regulation of business more directly, it determines what our lives will be like as citizens and as consumers. We lose control over these choices ourselves. It has to be kept in mind that whenever the government promises to do things for us, it cannot do those things for us without having the power to do things to us. And what is that to us? Well, if we're going to give you health care, then we will determine what choices of health care you will have. If we're going to plan your retirement, we will determine how much retirement money you have, what your options will be, what type of allocations and apportionments will be made, on and on and on. To the extent that the government introduces these plannings of activities through wealth distribution, through regulation of industry, to that extent they are controlling and directing our lives independent and separate of our own free and voluntary choices on our own and in our interactions with others in a competitive marketplace. So when some friends of freedom respond to the socialists of today, when the socialists say, well, we want to be like Sweden, we want to be like Denmark, we don't want to be like evil Soviet Stalinist Russia. And the conservative or even some free marketeers say, oh, no, Sweden, Denmark, they're not socialist societies. They're market societies with some redistribution. Well, they are markets, but they're regulated and controlled markets. And to the extent that they have welfare states, that redistributive hand is planning people's lives rather than letting those people plan for themselves. So it is the wrong tact to try to say, well, Sweden, Denmark, these other Western European countries don't have socialism. To the extent that that power and control over your own fruits of your labor are taken out of your hands and then determined and dictated by those in political power, your life is under socialist planning. And that's our dilemma. Wherever we look, socialism pervades the world. Different degrees, different forms, different types and extents. But we live in the age of socialism of one type or another.
Yeah, I think there's been really one age that didn't, and that was the United States. And I think it's important to emphasize how radically opposite the system was when the country got established. In fact, when the Constitutional Convention came out with the proposal to adopt a new federal government with the Constitution, if you had told Americans living at that time who had been operating under the Articles of Confederation for 13 years with a very weak federal government, the federal government didn't even have the power to tax, if you can believe that. Well, if you had told them that this is going to bring into existence, this Constitution, a federal government that's going to be based on the concept of a welfare state, where the government's got the power to seize money from anyone it wants, the wealthy, the middle class, the poor, whatever, and give it to other people. And a warfare state, too, where you have the government has the power to invade and occupy countries and assassinate and coups and regime change operations. There is no possibility, none, that the American people would have approved the deal. Instead, they brought into existence the unique way of life. It was different from anything that had ever existed. No mandatory charity at all. No warfare state at all. It was a system where people kept everything they earned. There was no income tax. And there was no Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Everybody kept what they earned, and they decided what to do with it. and then of course no warfare state to require that kind of largesse too, tax-funded largesse. It's an unbelievable way of life. That you also had open immigration, you had no gun control, you had no Federal Reserve System, you had gold coins and silver coins as the official money of the United States, which precluded the federal government from plundering and looting people with paper money. It was an unbelievably different way of life. And that was the key as they discovered. Now, they chose it because they said, this is what genuine freedom's all about. Well, the byproduct was that they discovered that this was the key to wealth. This is the key to higher standards of living. That when people are free to keep everything they earn, they save a bit of it, they put it in a bank, the employers go and borrow that money to have better tools, better equipment. That increases productivity, that increases revenue, that increases wage rates. So while statists, criticize the Industrial Revolution, as a matter of fact, the standard of living of people who were basically starting out with not very much in 1800, by the time 1900 comes along, the standard of living of the American people is skyrocketing, especially compared to the rest of the world. Now, the big exception, of course, was slavery. But notice that the mindset that guided slavery is much like the mindset that guides the welfare state. That you had blacks under total control. They didn't have a choice. But at the same time, they had a guaranteed job. They had food provided for them. They had clothing provided for them. They had housing. So in other words, we will take care of you, but in return, you will do as we say. And the biggest honor you could give a black is to free him, which meant we're not going to take care of you anymore. No more guaranteed job, no more guaranteed food, clothing, housing. You're on your own. And that's what African Americans were yearning for, that kind of freedom. The welfare state says, we will take care of you. You are our children. But in return for this, you're under our control. We decide how much money you're going to be permitted to keep as an allowance. If you ingest harmful substances, you will be relocated to one of our penitentiaries. And so it's that same mindset where we will take care of you, but in return you have to surrender your freedom. And so the biggest honor that they could accord African Americans would be a tremendous honor for us, Richard, if they would just free us by dismantling the system and restoring America's heritage of economic liberty, where people are free to keep everything they earn, they decide what to do with it, where there is no mandatory charity at all, which of course is not charity at all if it's mandated.
Your point about slavery, I'd like to sort of amplify something about that. There was in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s a Southerner named George Fitzhugh. And he was the great rationalizer and justifier and defender of the institution of slavery. And a major thrust of his two books, which were read religiously by slave owners and slave apologists in the South, was that compare the slave in the South with the free worker in the North. What does the Southern slave have? He has a roof over his head. He has 3 meals a day. He gets medical care. The slave plantation owner, he has an incentive to be concerned with the maintenance and care and well-being of his property, precisely because it's valuable and productive to him. And therefore, the master has an empathy and a sympathy and a self-interest in the well-being of his slaves. Compare that to the evil capitalist in the North. This was Fitzhugh's argument. The capitalist gets the worker at the lowest wage possible as the workers compete for the jobs available. And then once the wage has been paid, the worker leaves the factory at the end of the day, and does the capitalist employer care about him? Does he care about the quality of his food, the living conditions under which he resides? Does he care whether there's medical care for his workers? No, he's paid him the few pennies, and he's gotten the work out of them through extracting surplus value, sort of like a Marxian type argument. And therefore, he was arguing socialism is better because socialism is slavery, and the owner cares for that which is his. And now he basically said is that slavery should be extended to the North, and not just for blacks, but for whites, because there were people naturally who would be good as slave masters, and there are many people who are not able and qualified or have the mental or physical capacity to plan and direct their own lives. Slavery for all. That was how the future, what was to be bright and beautiful for the American people of the future. Now, this was the mentality of it. In other words, slavery is the guaranteed life from the good master, as opposed to the evil capitalist who pays you pennies and doesn't care about what happens to you. Not the government today and their attitude. The businessman is evil. He's going to pay you your wage, but he's greedy, he's selfish. He won't pay you the living wage, the $15 an hour wage. See how selfish he is as he rides off in his Cadillac back to his mansion in the suburbs. But now the government, they're going to give you Social Security. They're going to give you pension plans. They're going to guarantee you a living wage. They're going to give you free education. They're going to give. But for the government to do things for you, they have to do these things to you. They bind you. They control you. They determine the parameters in which you have the ability to act because they determine the constraints. And you are not free. So do we want to be like the slaves of Fritz Hugh's ideal slave society? Or do we want to be free men where we take responsibility for our own lives? And we don't want a master to be planning and controlling and directing and determining, but masters of our own life, deciding this for ourselves based upon what we think is good for ourselves and our family in free contract and exchange with our fellow men.
Yeah, see, that you've hit the nail on the head with that question, because what the welfare state has done is it has created this mindset of hopeless dependency, where the dole recipients say, oh my gosh, I couldn't do it in a free society. I would die, or there'd be people dying in the streets without Medicare and Social Security. I mean, they honestly believe it, and this is what the welfare state has done. It is irreparably damaged, or one would hope it's not irreparable. Self-reliance, can do, of course we can do it. I mean, freedom works. I mean, that's the way we libertarians believe. We believe in ourselves. We believe in others. We believe in freedom. For those of us who are believers, we have faith in God rather than the coercive apparatus of Caesar. There's another aspect here on the slavery analogy, Richard, and that is this argument that these programs need to be phased out. That Social Security needs to be phased out. Medicare needs to be phased out. Well, I would imagine there was the same people making that argument with respect to slaves. That, it would be cruel to free them all at once. Oh, we have to phase it out over time. They don't have any work skills. They've never been out on their own. They don't know how to get a job. They don't know how to open a business. Oh, no, we have to phase out slavery. And yet, on the day the Civil War ends, every black is freed automatically. And guess what happens? They start doing extremely well. In fact, there was one famous African-American woman, I think her name was Madam Walker, that became the first multi-millionaire woman in America, I think, if I got the stat right. She became a multi-millionaire, there's no doubt about that, doing hairdressing products. But other blacks were doing well as well in the marketplace. In fact, that's one of the main reasons that Jim Crow came into existence, because bigoted whites were being outcompeted by blacks in the marketplace. And so they needed to bring Jim Crow rules and regulations, licensure and the like, to keep African Americans down. The market really is a self-regulating process. It enables anybody who's able to serve his fellow man by producing goods and services that other people are willing to pay for, like Madam Walker was able to do. Those are the people that get wealthy. But in the process, they benefit everyone else in society, not only the people that are working in a successful business, but people in their role as consumers, and then people just in their role as people in that society where standards of living are rising because capital is making people more productive.
Yeah, and in fact, by the way, you are in the 1820s, the 1830s, part of the debate. 1840s, part of the debate was, well, how, if we're going to end slavery, in the United States. Think about the British colonies before emancipation of slavery in the British Empire in the 1830s. Well, don't we need to do it gradually? And for two reasons. Well, the slave owner, he has to adjust to have to paying market wages. So this could be harsh on his profit margin. The other thing was, can the slave adapt to being free? And maybe we need to sort of gradually educate, give him like a skills education of self-responsibility. Now, a sort of version of this was part of a debate between John Stuart Mill, the famous liberal and economist of the 19th century, and another liberal, Thomas Macaulay. Now, in his famous essay on liberty, Mill says at one point that for primitive and uneducated peoples, all they can hope for is to have a wise and benevolent ruler ruling over them until they have been educated to be able to be fully free. Thomas Macaulay replied to Mill in the following way. He said that Mill's argument was like the fool in the story who said he would not go into the water until he knew how to swim. You will not learn how to swim unless you go into the water. Indeed, it's by exercising freedom that you learn the responsible ways of using your freedom wisely. For as long as you are kept in slavery, you will never be able to be a free man. And trying to wean you out of it with being half free and half slave never works. As much as the idea of, partially or partly or half pregnant. You're either free or you're not.
On that excellent note, Richard, we're out of time. Time to wrap it up. Thank you. Enjoyed the conversation, and thank you all for tuning in. Come and visit us at fff.org. And Richard, I look forward to seeing you next week.
Until next time, and thank you to the viewers and listeners.